insider, right? So I was talking to one of the Fortune 500 company, defense contractors. They provide weaponry to the U.S. government, and one of their chief data officer, and I was talking, and he was explaining me the misery in something called being data driven, right? So he said, Vishal, this word is thrown a lot. Like even my boss asked me, hey, how can we be data driven, right? But then when you look at the size and, as I said, the maturity of the organization, the culture is very thick when it comes to disrupting and helping them understand like it's like data meeting a story, right? So the story is pretty robust. It has worked forever. Now you're saying, okay, no, there is something called data. It requires a cultural change. It requires a habit change. It requires so when. And I think so when you talk about when you talk to your organizations, when in your experience dealing with these large organizations, what are some of the best ways, some of the best practices that you have seen leaders utilize in getting on this bandwagon of being data driven faster than anyone could? And I'm not saying it's easy. It's definitely hard, but from your vantage point, what are some of the things that you have seen where it works for a leader? If I'm a leader stuck in an organization, how can I be data driven?
Yeah, let me come at this question a few different ways. So first of all, there's no magic bullets and no easy steps, and it's a long-term journey, and it's not a destination either. In other words, it's not a place where you get to and one day you say I'm data driven like king of the hill. You have to stay data driven. You have to fight and continue to improve each and every day if you want to stay there. And I can talk about some of the more successful data driven organizations, and those are ones that are always looking over their shoulder, never comfortable, never complacent. And when I worry is when I go into an organization and they say we have it all figured out. I could tell you a lot of stories. I could tell you stories about walking into organizations and meeting with the president of a line of business, and they say, yes, we'd like to bring your team in to work with us because we'd like to be data driven within 60 days. And I just, when I hear that, I say, it's, you really have to reset your expectations, because that's not the way this world operates. But to your point, we ask the survey participants, what's the principal challenge to becoming data-driven? And in 2021, 92.2% of the respondents indicated it was issues relating to culture, organizational alignment, change management, skill set, all of those factors. Only 7.8% point to technology as the primary barrier. So yeah, it represents a change, particularly because working with Fortune 1000 organizations, most of which have existed for generations, if not well over 100 years. They've had ways of operating that's been customary to their business. Data is an asset that flows across an organization, so it impacts everything that an organization does. Often we work with organizations to take them through a data lineage process so they can really appreciate where data originates, where it's consumed, where new data is created. Because up until that point, again, for many organizations, particularly with their executive management, it's a abstract concept. Sometimes executives will say to me, oh, not another data project. And I said, this is not just another data project. This is central to how you do business. If you don't understand who your customers are, if you don't understand how your products and services perform, if you don't understand that the markets that you're participating in or trying to enter into, and if you don't have the data to make those decisions on an informed basis, you're essentially flying blind. So this is not just another data project. This is absolutely existential to your continuity as a business and your future growth of the firm. I mean, look at companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, among others. They didn't exist a generation ago. Now they're among the largest market capitalization firms in the world. So you can be a large bank or insurance company and say, oh, well, I have huge market of customers that have done business with me for generations and generations. But look at Sears Roebuck. They were at top of the heap 25, 30 years ago. So things change, and particularly in this highly dynamic, evolving business environment in the digital age, companies really need to be aggressive about being data-driven, or they're going to face a challenge sooner than later. I have a chapter in the book on disruption, and each chapter begins with a literary quote, because I mentioned my literary background. So the chapter on disruption begins with a quote from Ernest Hemingway from his, I believe it was 1927 novel, The Sun Also Rises. And one character says to the other, how did you go bankrupt? And the character responds, gradually and then suddenly. And that's a great metaphor for disruption, because things can just be sailing along, but there's forces that are operating independent of your business. And at critical junctures in time, those forces can overtake you. So if you're not prepared, if you're not thinking about the future, and if you're not leveraging your data assets to the greatest extent that you can, you may wind up in one of those situations where the disruption comes gradually and then suddenly.
I think disruption is again a very interesting word. So basically I was reading this innovator's dilemma, right? So basically, I really want your perspective on it. So being data driven, right? So what Christensen was suggesting was that, hey, you look at the small trends, you say, okay, let me just make sure no trends get unchecked, and then you see a disruption happening, right? And there's a very small window, sliver window, where you have to react as an organization to grab a disruptive trend. So now I keep quoting this conversation I had with the BlackBerry, one of their product managers there, right? And he was saying we were hitting all of our numbers. It was like we were data driven. We understand our customers. We had their pulse right, uh, our hand on their pulse. But the whatever the undercurrents were happening, right? It totally missed us by surprise. And if you look at say what data has given us over last 2 years, whether you call it Brexit, whether you call it any elections, and our predictability on what we think could be delivered, it has not given a favorable rating of our reliability on data. So when you look at those two trends, right? When you look at the importance of being data driven, because you have better eyes, you have better reaction abilities, and then you see if your data is your analysis is as good as your data, right? Or as good as the sources you're pulling it from. How do you grapple this phenomena?
Yeah, let me speak to that in two ways. So since you mentioned Clayton Christensen and the Innovator's Dilemma, one of the books that I've always admired is Crossing the Chasm by
Hmm.
Geoffrey Moore.
Hmm.
And so Geoffrey Moore wrote one of the praise blurbs that appears on the back cover of the book. But it's interesting because he looks at all from, he's actually a PhD in English, but he brings this physics mindset. So I just want to read a little bit from his quote, because I think it speaks to your question. So he says, big data is indeed crossing the chasm that separates early adopters from the mainstream of enterprise customers. As Randy Bean makes abundantly clear in Fail Fast, Learn Faster, this crossing is by no means smooth. Through a wonderful horde of business anecdotes, he shows over and over again that the challenge of becoming a data-driven business has little to do with the big data itself. It is only marginally about mastering the technology needed to harness it. Rather, it is primarily about leadership teams finding forcing functions that can drive massive changes in the roles, processes, and systems that make up their enterprise. For some, the forcing function will be regulatory demands. For others, a global market demanding draconian cost reductions. For others, an emerging competitive threat from digital disruptors. And still for others, a mission to solve customer problems that cannot be addressed by conventional means. And then he closes, as a reader of Randy's book, it is your job to determine the forcing function that will drive change for your organization and draw upon this wealth of examples to navigate your way forward.